Good morning and welcome back. Today we have me, Kit Winder, and James Allen joining me because we're going to talk about a couple of different things, and Baz is taking a couple of well-earned days off. So James, welcome.
Hello there. I hope everyone is well.
Now, one of the big pieces of news from our perspective last week, James, was this mega EU recovery deal that they're going to try and push through with permission from all the different nation states. It's going to be 750 billion euros. And a quarter of it, crucially, is earmarked for green investment. So it's a recovery package that is also going to stimulate a sort of green recovery, so that the recovery is not helping polluting fossil fuels and airlines and these kind of things. They want to, restart on the right foot when they rebuild the economy after coronavirus. What over the last sort of decade or so, what has been the relationship between big government policy and the energy transition?
It depends where we're talking about, really. Certainly in Europe, it's been quite a close relationship. We've seen lots of subsidies going into the green energy sector. That's really given the green sector a real push, a needed push, like every other sort of nascent industry. It does need a helping hand when it starts. That has correlated into some real sort of big successes, I suppose, in the renewable energy industry. We've seen costs come down hugely, sort of technological improvements, all sort of helped by government subsidies. We're now seeing sort of unsubsidized solar as some of the cheapest electricity on the grid anywhere in history. That is in a large part to do with government subsidies. But now, before sort of COVID-19, we're all sort of getting to the point where the industry was sort of weaning itself off subsidies. Now, obviously, the pandemic is causing a huge slowdown in economic activity. The EU is ahead of the game. It thinks renewable energy, clean energy. We need to hit those decarbonisation targets, and it's tying its sort of economic stimulus packages towards that, basically, because it sees that economic growth, is actually tied directly to renewable energy and hitting our clean energy goals, really. So it was really good to see what the EU is doing. I mean, they're ahead of the pack in many ways. The UK has been a bit silent on what it's going to do. I fully expect it to announce something in terms of its a green sort of stimulus package. The US has been silent, really, but the EU is ahead of the game. So it's a great time. It's what actually we've been predicting in Exponential Energy Fortunes for the last couple of months. We expected to see these sort of green tinted plans come through, and our stocks have sort of risen in accordance with that, basically. So yeah, it was good to see that last week.
Right, now, you're right that your work in Exponential Energy Fortunes is looking very much at the incredible technology companies and the entrepreneurial and business leaders from the private sector who are driving this transition. Why is it that the private sector can't achieve the energy transition on its own?
Well, subsidies are important for any industry, not just green energy. I mean, green energy, it's a resource-rich, it's high capex projects. Solar and wind are sort of huge, high capex projects. So certainly sort of 10, 15 years ago, it required government subsidies. These are big projects where the payoff down the line, I suppose. So it was hard for sort of startups, private capital to make an immediate return. Obviously, there was a lot of private capital going into it, but government subsidy really did play its part. And it's look at where the UK is right now. We've got coal off the grid. We've got solar and mainly wind in the UK going great guns. It's like almost sort of record-breaking levels of generation from the renewable sector in the UK. But it's I would say before COVID, and even with COVID, really, I mean, it's not really reliant on subsidies anymore. I mean, this is a one-way ticket, really. I mean, we're still going to see increasing amounts of renewable penetration on the grid, irrespective of government subsidies now, because the costs have come down. But what the governments are doing is they're looking longer term. They're looking where they really stimulate the economy, and they've realised, or they should be realising, that green energy is a way to do that. It's a real way to bring out jobs, growth in the economy, GDP, So it's not just about putting green energy on the grid. It's actually about all those other economic factors. And then let's not forget, we still have stringent sort of net zero 2050 targets to get. So it's all combined into a sensible strategy from the EU to put money into these technologies. But as I say, I mean, we're still going to get increasing amounts of renewable energy onto the grids. Still going to see electric cars overtake petrol-based cars at some point, irrespective of government subsidies. But it gives it a helping hand, and it also requires growth in the economy. So it's win-win.
Yeah, well, James, you're absolutely right there to point out that it's not just about renewables, this fund. So they've got the $750 billion euro fund that they're proposing, and a quarter of this, so about 160 billion euros, is going to go towards 4 key pillars of a green recovery. The first one, as you say, is renewables, especially offshore. But they're also focusing on cleaner transportation and logistics, so fleets of electric delivery trucks or hydrogen-fueled long-distance trucking. They're also looking at a significant renovation of buildings and infrastructure, so making buildings more energy efficient, because as we know, energy efficiency is a sort of dream low-hanging fruit where you can save carbon emissions without having to create new things. And the final one is kickstarting the European hydrogen economy, the clean green hydrogen economy, where hydrogen is produced by renewable energy, so that it's not, it doesn't use natural gas or coal infrastructure to be created. So there's 4 key pillars there. And you're absolutely right. It sort of reminds me a bit of the SpaceX launch, which is obviously the big event over the weekend, was Americans going into space for the first time in 9 years, I think. And it was an amazing thing to watch. And the interesting way it worked was that previously NASA would do it on its own, and it was incredibly expensive. But using a much smaller investment in a private company and getting the private company to drive that, competing against others. So it was SpaceX, and then Jeff Bezos's one. I actually don't know that much about it, but this is the idea of giving money to private enterprises to compete actually drives it faster and cheaper. And it sounds like what you're saying is slightly the same, is that subsidies used to be the only relevant factor, but now the private sector is taking on, and so the government involvement is a sort of helping hand or a nudge or a gentle encouragement to compete, and the offer of reward, but it's no longer the sole factor. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we were already seeing renewable energy. We were seeing electric vehicles come onto the grids. Government subsidies were actually sort of coming down, and at some point, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and the rest will be solely. They'll be able to compete completely without government subsidy. And by the way, let's not forget that fossil fuels also is still a big recipient of government subsidies as well. So let's not pretend this is just a one way. It's only green energy is receiving sort of government subsidies. But yeah, as I say, I mean, the sector was weaning itself off government subsidies. But where's the growth? Where would the EU want to put public money towards? Would they want to put it towards fossil fuels, ICE vehicles? No, not at all. They see growth, long-term growth into green energy. So, you talked about the pillars there that they're putting money towards: cars, renewable energy, energy efficiency. These are all parts of the economy. Actually, we have stakes in our own Exponential energy portfolios. We have stocks in all those sort of sectors. So it's really just pleasing to see. The real sort of in terms of renewable energy, actually, I mean, the next frontier, I suppose, isn't actually one of cost or economics, because the economic case is actually it's won. I mean, renewable energy is cheaper than coal, for existing coal, these old legacy systems on the grid already. New sort of renewable is cheaper than that. The next frontier, what it would be great to see some of this money go towards is technological improvements. Really getting, for example, sort of grid scale batteries and things like that, to really allow huge amounts of renewable energy, surplus renewable energy, to be stored and released onto the grid when it's needed. That it's those types of technological barriers that these sort of subsidies, this EU money, can actually really help drive. Basically, it's not really one of a cost anymore. I think the economics for renewable energy are so sort of irresistible, and they stand on their own 2 feet, with or without government subsidies, really. But yeah, it was really pleasing to see what the EU did, and it set up a great sort of time, really, a future for our portfolio, because we have stocks in all those sectors. Basically, it's putting money towards. So, yeah, this is something we called as the crash was happening around us a few months ago. The pandemic and stock markets were falling. We held firm, and we were still issuing buy recommendations for our service, because we thought, there is going to be an associated sort of government response, economic response, and we forecast, we predict that green energy, electric vehicles, and the like will be recipients of that, because we still have these big targets, climate change targets, and it's a perfect vehicle for growth. And our portfolio has been the beneficiary of that over the last few months. We've seen some amazing share price response, really. So it's been a really exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the it's been an extraordinary couple of months, really, because the crash was so ferocious, but the rally has been so in equal measure. And if you're looking at, as you say, these green small energy technology stocks that you and I look at, some of the share price returns over the last couple of months have been extraordinary. And all those people who were listening to Beyond Oil, some of you may be listening today, may have been lucky enough to see that with James in his Exponential Energy Fortunes service. Now, James, one of the things you mentioned there was investing now in technology. And, I'm wondering, we've been speaking about the EU mainly, but about the UK, where does the UK stand internationally in sort of its main contributions to the energy transition? What are we good at here, and what could we do better?
Traditionally, we've actually been really sort of on the front lines, I suppose. We've helped drive energy transition. We've got a very successful renewable industry, a very successful, in specific, offshore wind industry. We have sort of huge offshore wind farms out in the North Sea, onshore wind as well. We were ahead of the game on onshore wind. Then sort of the last government sort of did cut subsidies. There was lots of planning issues with onshore wind, and that sort of stalled a bit. But that's been sort of that's now back up and running again as well. But offshore wind has really allowed the UK to be at the forefront of global renewable penetration. Really, I can't think of many other countries around the world that have helped drive renewable energy. I mean, there's obviously there's a few in Europe which are comparable, but we just have to look at what's happening on our power grid and the electricity markets. We don't see coal has been all but driven off the grid, and we are seeing right now, the last month or two, we've seen upwards of sort of 50% of renewables onto the grid of demand. So it's just UK has been good, but let's not get complacent, really. I mean, we missed our last carbon targets, the mandated carbon cuts. We missed those. I think that was going out to 2035 in terms of what we're expected to do. We have a big challenge to get towards net zero in 2050. So although we can give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back in terms of what we've done to coal and solar and a bit of solar and a lot of wind onto the grid, that's not the whole picture at all. There's a lot more to do, and that's why there's other technologies that we're particularly excited about, which really can drive sort of clean energy penetration in the UK, such as hydrogen and things like that. And electric vehicles, that was going well. I've purchased an electric vehicle myself. There's increasingly more amounts of electric vehicles on the car, but there's a lot more needs to be done. There's a ban coming, though, which is good news for the ban of new sales of ICE and diesel cars. ICE is basically petrol cars. So we've done well, but let's not get complacent. There's a lot more to do to hit our 2050 targets in a nutshell.
Yeah, so one of the Twitter pages that I quite like is just called Coal GB Grid, and all it does is provide an hourly tweet when it says how much coal has been used in generating electricity in the UK. But it's been having a real fun time with it recently, because it just says naught every hour for the last 52 days. And it records, so we haven't used any coal in generating electricity in this country for 52 days in a row now, which is a national record since we had our first coal introduced onto the grid in 1882, I believe. And it is an extraordinary thing.
I mean, it really is quite remarkable. If you just, not long ago, and when I first came into the energy markets about sort of 15 years ago, I suppose, I was an electricity market reporter for a big sort of price supporting agency, and really to set the electricity price. Really, it became you really had to look at what coal was doing and what natural gas was doing, because they were the two big providers of electricity, the two big fuel sources of electricity in the UK. And my job a lot of the time was calling up power traders in big coal plants, like Drax and the rest, and they had the most informed. They were the big players, I suppose, in the UK power sector. And now look at it. There's no, not 10, 15 years later, there's no coal on the grid whatsoever. It is actually quite remarkable that the UK, a huge industrialised nation, has managed to do that. And it's been a combination of government policy. We set a carbon tax. The EU has helped. They had they've got the emissions trading scheme, which puts a price on carbon. So that's all. What that's done is just push up the price of producing coal. As well as that, we've had just plummeting costs of solar and wind costs as well. So it's been a two-pronged whammy, I suppose, to take coal off the grid. It's just quite remarkable what has happened, and the UK should be proud of itself. I mean, there's not many other big industrialised nations that have done something like that, really. But again, let's not get complacent. We still have these big overarching 2050 net zero targets to achieve.
Indeed. And of course, we were supposed to be hosting the COP26, the 26th International sort of Climate Agreement meeting in Glasgow this year. That I've just seen that's now been officially delayed until next year. They were thinking about doing a sort of virtual conference. But they decided it was more important that countries could have a chance to stabilize, really think about how to spend the next decade transitioning, and maybe look for some more agreements along the lines of Paris 2015, which is where the major climate, when the major sort of 2050 targets were introduced and where all of the big promises were made. Do you have high hopes that countries will maintain their focus on the climate emergency and the energy transition over the coming year, or are you concerned that coronavirus might, despite these great intentions by the EU, that coronavirus might be more problematic than people currently hope?
No, I do have high hopes. I do think that, when governments are looking for growth, where's the growth going to come from to kickstart their economies in a post-coronavirus world? They'll look at what the EU has done. There's no better place for government money, for public money, than green energy, for electric vehicles and things like that. And I also have high hopes for what the UK will do with we're hosting the meeting next November, so it's a bit of time off, but we certainly won't want to we'll want to come to the table with exciting policy and good intentions of what we're doing, basically. So I think it's a promising, it's an extremely encouraging sign that we're hosting that conference. And I think I think it will be a good time for the UK green energy sector because of that. Because I think for optics, if nothing else, we'll want to show that we're serious. We can't host it and bring nothing to the table. So I think for most major economies, it's obviously very uncertain what's happening around the world right now. But I think green energy will win out. I think it's a logical place to put public money. And I think what the EU has done will be sort of a flagship, I suppose, and other countries will follow.
Indeed, it feels like the idea of hosting the summit is a bit like hosting the Olympics. And of course, 2012, I think, was our most successful Olympics in a very long time, or potentially ever. Because when you're hosting something, you're sort of much more motivated to prove yourself on home soil. The home advantage in football, the home advantage in climate emergency talks. So perhaps we will see a sort of the virtue signalling Olympics up in Glasgow next year, except, with real results. That would be nice. Well, James, thanks very much for speaking to me today about the impact of, big government and policy on the energy transition. It's been very interesting.
My pleasure. And I think we're talking again tomorrow.
Perfect. Yes, we are indeed. James, see you tomorrow, and everyone else, thanks very much for listening.